Okay, let's be real. HTML interviews can be pretty stressful, right? But what if you had a playbook, a guide to the exact questions that almost always pop up? Well, that's what this is. We're going to turn that interview anxiety into total confidence. Let's dive in.
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to tackle 14 of the most important questions, broken down into 4 key sections. We'll kick things off with the core building blocks, the absolute foundation of any web page you've ever seen.
So, first up, the core building blocks. You can think of these as the fundamental, non-negotiable rules of the web. You have to know this stuff cold before you can build anything great.
So, first question, what are semantic HTML elements? Well, the name itself gives you a huge hint. These are the HTML tags that give real meaning, ASL meaning, to your content. They don't just tell a browser what something should look like. They explain what it is. And that difference is everything.
I mean, you see these everywhere. Header, section, article. Now, unlike a plain old div or span, which are basically just empty boxes you use for styling, these tags clearly define the structure of your page. And that is a massive win for accessibility and for SEO.
Okay, what about that very first line you see in literally every HTML file? The DOCTYPE HTML. First thing to know, it's not actually an HTML tag. It's a declaration. It's just you, the developer, telling the browser, hey, listen up. Build this page using the modern, standard HTML5 rules, so nothing looks broken or weird. Simple as that.
Next up, we've got something called void elements. I like to think of them as the loners of the HTML world. They're totally self-contained. That means they don't have a closing tag because, well, they can't have anything inside them. Think about an image tag, image, or a line break, BR. They just exist on their own.
All right, let's move on to section 2. This is where we get into those classic this versus that questions. Interviewers love these because they're a great way to check if you really understand the small details and the real funda of how different tags work.
First up, the classic, div versus span. It's actually pretty simple. A div is a block-level element, like a big container for major layout sections. It always takes up the full width. A span, on the other hand, is inline. You use it for wrapping small bits of text or other content inside a line, maybe to style a single word differently.
And another big one, ID versus class. Here's the deal. An ID has to be 100% unique on the entire page. Only one element can have it. But a class, you can use the same class on tons of different elements to group them together for styling. One is for an individual, the other's for a group.
And if you're ever stuck, here is a killer memory hack. Just think of it like this. एक ID आपके आधार नंबर जैसा है. It's totally unique, just for one person. और एक class एक category जैसी है, जिसमें काफी लोग या elements आ सकते हैं. You remember that, and you'll never mix them up again.
Okay, let's clear up another common point of confusion. Section versus article. A section is for grouping related content together, kind of like a chapter in a book. But an article is a complete, self-contained piece of content that could be pulled out and distributed on its own and still make sense, like a whole blog post. Now, this one is so important, especially when we talk about accessibility. Using strong and emphasis is semantic. It tells screen readers that this text has importance or emphasis. But using B and I, that's purely visual. It just changes the look without adding any of that deeper meaning. Okay, on to section 3. This is where we start getting into the stuff that separates the pros from the beginners. This is where you can really show an interviewer that you have a deeper understanding of modern web development. Let's talk accessibility and custom data. So, have you ever seen those attributes that start with data dash and wondered what they're for? These are custom data attributes. Think of them as little sticky notes or hidden labels that you can attach to your HTML elements. They don't change how anything looks, but they're super useful for storing extra info that your JavaScript can easily grab and work with.
All right, let's talk about a really important topic, accessibility, or as you'll often see it written, A11Y. At its core, it's about making sure that the websites we build can be used by everyone, including people with physical or cognitive disabilities. This isn't just some optional feature. It's a fundamental part of being a good web developer.
So, how do you actually do it? Well, the good news is it's all about using the things we've already talked about. Using semantic HTML, adding good alt text to your images, using proper headings. See, the key is that accessibility shouldn't be something you try to tack on at the end. It needs to be part of your process from the very start.
But what happens when basic HTML isn't enough? Especially for complex, custom things you build with JavaScript, like a pop-up modal or a tabbed interface. That's where ARIA comes in. These are special attributes that give screen readers extra hints about what's going on. But always remember the golden rule. Use native HTML whenever you can. ARIA is there to help, not to replace it.
All right, we're in the home stretch. For our final section, we're going to zoom out and look at the big picture. We'll explore how browsers actually turn your code into a web page, how search engines see your site, and a couple of key philosophies that drive modern web development.
Let's talk about two meta tags that are absolutely non-negotiable. First, charset equals UTF-8. This is like a language translator for the browser, making sure your text displays correctly. The second is the viewport tag. This one is like a screen adjuster, and it's essential for making sure your site looks good on mobile phones. You need both, every single time.
You know what's cool is that when you write good, clean HTML, you're also doing a huge favor for your site's SEO. By using semantic tags, a proper heading structure, and good alt text, you're not just making a better site for users, you're giving search engines like Google a perfect roadmap to understand, index, and rank your content.
Have you ever wondered what actually happens when a browser turns your code into a web page? It seems like magic, but it's a really cool 5-step process. Sumjo. First, the browser reads your HTML and builds a structural map of it. Just go in the DOM tree. Pair. It does the same for the CSS, creating the CSSOM tree. Then, it merges those two together to create what's called a render tree, figures out the position and size of everything, and finally, it paints all the pixels onto the screen.
And finally, let's touch on two big picture philosophies you'll hear about. Graceful degradation means you build the fancy version first and then try to make it work for older browsers. But the modern, much better approach is progressive enhancement. You start with a simple, solid, accessible foundation that works everywhere, and then you add the fancy features on top. It's like building a bicycle first, then upgrading it to a car.
And there you have it. We've just powered through 14 of the most important questions that create a rock-solid foundation for any HTML interview. We've covered everything from semantics and accessibility all the way to how browsers work. You've got the key concepts down.
So look, you've got the knowledge now. You can walk into that interview feeling confident. But the real question is, are you ready to take that knowledge and use it to build a better, faster, and more accessible web for everyone? Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.